we just reviewed that we went through the primary commonalities or components of most behavioral parent training programs. So reinforcement, labeled praise, ignoring, timeout, etc. So then in sessions 7, 8, and 9, they are more intensive behavioral plans. And so we're going to start with daily report card. And we will probably skip over, in some respects, a point system, because in many ways a point system is similar to a daily report card, just that we are using a token economy or something more visual, tangible, and doing it on a frequency basis rather than perhaps on an interval basis. And I'll explain the difference between what I mean. So a daily report card is the topic for this session. And again, what we'll do is we'll review past homework, review concepts about the ABCs, how does this fit in. What a daily report card really is it's intervening at both the antecedent level by sharing with kids expectations and goals, and also intervening on the consequence level by offering more structured, systematic rewards for attaining behavioral goals. Excuse me. So again, the goals of this session I think I've pretty well developed. I'm going to get more into the meat of what a daily report card is. This would be an example of what a daily report card looks like. So it's helping parents to identify frequently occurring problematic behaviors, helping them to create behavioral goals which reflect an improvement in those problematic behaviors. Not perfection, but an improvement. And then setting up those goals to be specifically rewarded for their attainment. So in this example, we have a child who has been breaking house rules frequently. So we set a goal for the child that they would follow house rules with no more than 3 rule violations or 3 reminders per period. And then broke the day up for kids into morning, after school, dinner, and bedtime. So what the parent would do in the implementation of a daily report card, and we'll get into the mechanics of how do you set this up, how do you create those goals, but it gives them an opportunity to say, you broke one of our house rules, that's one of your goals. Or you broke another house rule, that's one of your goals. Your goal is to have 3 or fewer house rules. Okay, you didn't have any more, you didn't break any more rules this morning, great job, you met that goal. So for this specific behavior you had, you either achieved that goal or didn't achieve that goal. Same thing with, did they complete homework on time? Or did they tease their siblings? Or was their bedtime routine? It's a way of systematically tracking multiple problematic behaviors that a child might be having and giving them frequent feedback on those behaviors. Now, there are several ways to implement a daily report card once it's set up. This is a daily report card that would probably be developed for like a 9 or 10-year-old child. So it has multiple goals, and reasonably a child who's 9 or 10 could probably handle 3 or 4 behavioral goals. If I was setting up a daily report card with a younger child, I would probably use more kid-friendly language, have pictures of the behavior that I wanted them to see or some kind of visual reminder. Instead of doing yeses or nos, I might do smiley faces or sad faces. Also, the way I have this daily report card set up for a 10-year-old is for them at the end of the day to see how many of their goals they met or how many yeses they earned compared to how many goals they didn't meet or how many no's they received. And then set up a reward menu at the bottom. So I have down here the number of yeses they received and their score. So did they get a 50% of their goal day, a 75% of their goal day, 100% of their goal day, and I will match up a percentage day to a reward chart. So a more enticing reward would be achieved for earning more of their goals or having a higher percentage of yeses for their daily report card goals. A lower reward would be for a day where they didn't meet as many of their behavioral goals. If I had a younger child, I would probably not wait until the end of the day, but I might build in reward opportunities throughout the day. So when morning was over, I might go through with them and say, you had 2 goals for this morning. The first goal was to have 3 or fewer reminders for breaking our house rules. I had to tell you 2 times that you had broken a house rule, but not a 3rd time, so you got it, buddy. You made that goal. You worked really hard to follow house rules. You earned a yes. And I didn't have to tell you any times not to tease your brother, which makes me so proud of you. You got a yes for the morning as well. So you earned 2 yeses. You get to earn a reward from our morning yes chart or from our morning reward chart. So it gives me an opportunity as well, depending on the age of the child and the ability of the family, to determine how many times a day I'm going to let them earn a reward for strategically making goals that we've set up for them. Okay? Does this so far start to make a little sense? Make some sense? Okay. So this is just an example. It's not what daily report cards have to look like. But what I want to do is go through the mechanics of how to get to an example like this, how to get to a daily report card. Because a lot of times, behavioral charts can be very effective. And a daily report card is analogous to a daily behavior chart. But where behavioral charts can go awry is the goals that are set up for the kids are too hard or conversely too easy, and therefore aren't changing behavior swiftly. Or the goals are too many for the developmental age of the child. Or the reward is too far away from when the goals are happening to work. And so I want us to go through, how do you build and develop a behavioral chart or a behavioral goal system or a daily report card effectively for kids? And then how do you help parents to monitor and modify that goal chart based upon how kids are doing? Because that is really the essential element of what makes behavior charts effective, is are they at the level needed for the child, and are they challenging the child at the rate that they should? I'm going to skip this for now. So essentially a daily report card is the same title. It's an interchangeable title. You could say daily report card, you could say behavioral goal chart, behavior chart, star chart, anything that's essentially creating a goal for a child, monitoring that goal, and adjusting the goal as the child's getting better. Part of the reason why this is something that we move to is, even though it's more intensive than just simply doing behaviors like ignoring, in total it's a relatively cost little and time little intervention to motivate kids and to monitor their behavioral change. It also is something that can serve as a tool for communication between the parents and the child about how they're doing in their progress on their behavioral goals. And finally, daily reports or daily behavioral charts are necessary because for some children, they need specific feedback about their rewards and goals, and specific feedback about their behavior. Not just, hey, you had a really great day today, but this was your goal and you either met it or you didn't. So it creates goals that are a bit more concrete and attainable for the child. So the first step in establishing a daily report card are selecting areas for improvement. The more caregivers we can involve in the discussion of the child's behavior and what areas need improved, the more exhaustive the daily report card will be. We then want to choose the child's greatest areas of impairment. That is, the areas of change would improve the child's major problems the most. So for some kids, we're going to have a lot of behaviors that need to change. And we're going to have to strategically pick the ones that are most important or would have the biggest impact in the child's functioning to be on the behavior chart or the daily report card. And then we're going to define the goals in which the child should be working in terms of these areas of impairment. So before moving on, let me actually go back for a second. I want you to think about some of the children with whom you work, or your own child if you want to. And I want you, we don't have to work in partners, but I want you to write down what are some areas of the child's life that we want to choose to target, meaning to focus goals on that area of their life. So what are some behaviors or some areas of impairment the child's having? So what are the areas we're going to try to pick in setting up a behavioral chart or a daily report card? So jot a few of those down. Okay, so once we've picked the areas that the child needs to show improvement, or the areas of impairment, We want to transition from domains of impairment or areas in which this child's struggling in daily life and to make those more defined goals. So as an example, we may say that the child's struggling with their siblings. And that would be an area of impairment or an area where the child's struggling. They're struggling with their siblings. The relationship with their siblings is not good. In terms of picking behaviors, though, we want our behaviors to be observable, definable behaviors again. So we want to think about what behaviors are contributing to that impairment in daily life functioning. So if we're struggling with siblings, what's contributing to this struggling? Is it that they're physically fighting with siblings? Is it that they're verbally fighting with siblings? Is it that they're not sharing? And it might be all of the above. But what we need to do is pick the behaviors we think are most contributing to that impairment and use those behaviors to define what we call target behaviors or goals. And the things to keep in mind is that, again, the behavioral goals are things that must be definable. So it's very clear, very black and white. The child either achieved this goal or did not achieve this goal. So things like got along with siblings would not be a very good goal, because even one instance of not getting along with siblings would mean they did not achieve that goal. Or really, who is defining what getting along with siblings means? An easier to define goal might be something like has 0 instances of physically hitting his brother, or has 1 or fewer instances of verbally fighting with his brother, needs 1 or fewer reminder to play nicely with his siblings. So something that the child can count, something that's definable. For most kids of elementary school age, between 3 to 8 target behaviors are appropriate. Older kids can handle more behaviors, younger kids fewer behaviors. And especially if the behaviors are going to be difficult for the child to maintain, we may want to start fewer rather than more. For teenagers, we use a daily report card frequently, though we don't call it a daily report card. Typically what we do is we tie it more to kids' allowance or to their behavioral expectations for the day, but older children can certainly handle more behavioral targets. Though really, I probably would not go much more than what we would do for an elementary school kid, because the behaviors that we tend to define for adolescents are more complex chain behaviors, like getting your homework done or cleaning up your room. So they can handle a more complex behavior, but will tend to stay about the same number of targets, even though the behavior is more complex. Does that make sense? Okay. So of those areas of impairment that you chose for the child with whom you work, or maybe one of your children, if you've not done so already, I want you to think about what would be a good definable goal. So if I asked it as a question, did you fight with your brother more than once? The answer is yes or no. So how could you take some of those areas of impairment and write them into behavioral goals for the child? Things that could be answered with a yes or a no. So jot down some behavioral goals under those areas of impairment if you've not done so already. So once we've identified some of those goals, so for instance, fought with his brother, yes or no, the next thing that we need to consider is that for many of our kids, they're not at a level where we can say if a behavior happens once, it's a no, or else they'd be getting no's for everything. We have to set realistic expectations. So we've identified the areas of impairment. We've, to an extent, identified some behavioral goals, meaning observable, definable goals. And now we have to set levels for those goals that are realistic for the child to achieve. And what we know is that kids can reasonably make about a 20% change at a time. So what that means is if a child is interrupting 10 times a day, and we want them to interrupt maybe once or twice at most, that's too big of a jump for most kids to make. They're just going to fail. And so many repeated experiences of failing leads to what? Frustration. Kids not wanting to continue to do it. This is a hard thing for parents to come to terms with, though, because oftentimes we hear them say, but I don't want them to think it's okay for them to interrupt 8 times a day. That's not okay with me. That's not my expectation. And I get that. That's not our expectation either. But again, this is a form of successive approximation for getting kids towards a goal. An analogy that I often use is I'm not a runner. In fact, I'm probably the poorest runner you will ever encounter in your life. I mean, it's really embarrassingly impressive how little I can run. And if you told me to run a marathon, if that was your expectation of me, I would die. Like physically, I would drop dead before finishing that marathon. And this is naturally a very dramatic example for me to use, but I also think it's truthful. I think I would just drop dead on the floor before ever getting a marathon. So if you said, run a marathon, it's not gonna happen. I'm just too far away from what that goal is. If you even said, run a 5K, guess what? Not gonna happen. You're gonna be lucky if I run to that door. But I can probably run to that door, particularly if I had an incentive in place. But sometimes if the goal is too far from what I can even achieve, it doesn't matter how big that incentive is. It doesn't matter if you gave me an Xbox 360. It doesn't matter if you gave me a shopping spree to Bloomingdale's. Marathon's just not happening. But what I could do is run to that door and feel some success. And then maybe run from the door to the elevator and feel some success. And that's essentially what we're talking about with successive approximation, or shaping behavioral goals, behavioral targets for kids, is stair-stepping their progress, allowing them to experience success as they're making behavioral pattern changes. So kids can make about a 20% change at a time, realistically. So if we see that kids are interrupting 10 times a day, a reasonable goal for a child to achieve is about 8 times a day. And that's really, maybe we could squeak by with a goal of 7, but we really can't expect much more change than that. Not just kids, all of us. We make about a 20% change at a time. So what we would ask parents to do is to try to identify for us, to the extent they can, how frequently their problematic target behaviors are actually happening. And sometimes this might mean we have to have parents track it for a few days. And tracking can be impressive on multiple levels. It can be impressive how less frequently behaviors happen than they think they do, or how much more frequently behaviors happen than they think they do. And sometimes parents say, it's just tracking's not gonna happen. I could track for an hour, but I can't track all day. Okay, we can kind of take that and extrapolate what all day might be. Or they might give us their best guess. So let's say I have a hypothetical child, and here are all of the things that the parents wish they would get better at in their tracking of their behaviors. So they interrupt about 12 times a day. They don't follow house rules 40 times a day. Though as an aside, if they're breaking house rules 40 times, I may relook at those house rules. But for hypothetically, they break house rules 40 times a day. They only do about 1 out of 3 assignments that they've been given for homework. Their work's sloppy and inaccurate. When I check it, they only get about half of their problems right. They're arguing with their sibling. They're complaining a lot about their homework and blaming other people like the teacher for having given them everything. Don't do what the parent says. Talk back to adults. A lot of really disruptive behavior. What my first thing is going to do is to select the behaviors I think that are most impairing to that child. So looking at that list, I don't think I can target all of those at once. That might be a lot for a kid. But I might pick 3 or 4, or depending on the child's age, maybe 1 more that I want that child to focus on. So what do you think are some of the more impairing things, or what I might pick? Let's say he's hypothetical. Let's say he's 10.
10?
Sure.
Don't finish homework. Doesn't finish homework.
So that might be an important one. We want to focus on finishing homework. Arguing with the siblings might be another one.
Violations for house rules. Maybe there's a lot of rules.
Maybe there's a lot of house rules, and that's why there's so many violations, or maybe I need to relook at my house rules. But regardless, there's a lot, so that might be an area for impairment or for improvement.
And then
Doing what the parent asks, so compliance. So what I've essentially done is, once I've identified the behaviors, how frequently I think they're happening, I pick the ones that are most important to focus on. So let's take house rule violations for a minute. If it's happening 40 times per day, here's all your math for you. What would be a 20% reduction, or what would be a reasonable guess? 32, yeah. So going down by about 8. Or if they're interrupting 12 times a day, we really could probably only expect them to change maybe to 10 or to 9. Talking back to adults, if that's happening 15 times per day, a realistic expectation might be 12. So essentially reducing the number by a couple. Okay? So now a lot of parents are going to say, 32 times a day, are you kidding me? I need to reward my child if they've only broken a house rule 32 times instead of 40. That seems totally unrealistic. But the other thing that we're going to work with parents on is chunking up the day for the child. So not just looking at it all day long, how many times have you messed up, but saying, let's break up our day by the morning and the afternoon. Or let's break up our day by morning, afternoon, dinner, and bedtime. Or what are the natural breaks that you have in your day? How can we naturally chunk up your day? Because now instead of saying 32 times or less you're breaking a house rule, we might say you get 8 warnings in the morning. So if you break house rules 8 or fewer times before we take off for school, that's a yes, you met your goal. Or if talking back to adults, our goal for the day is 12, and we break it up into 4 segments, that would be you have 3 or fewer times that you talked back to me. So if you talk back 3 or fewer times, that's a yes. Now again, parents are likely to say, but I don't want to accept any times that they talk back to me, or I don't want to reward 3 times. And what I would emphasize to parents is we're not going to stay at 3 times forever. But what you're telling me is if it's happening this frequently, getting yeses or making these goals is an improvement. It's at least a 20% improvement in your life, in your interaction with your child. And once kids are successful for several days in a row, we can make that goal lower again. But if we keep doing what we've been doing, which is saying, I don't want you to ever interrupt, but you're interrupting 10 times a day, that gap is going to stay there. It's too big of a change for kids to make on their own. It's too big of a change for a lot of us to make on our own. So what we have to say is we have to give you an attainable goal and celebrate the success of your change. Even though you're still impaired, even though there's still a problem, you've made some positive inroads. You've made some positive changes. Your behavior is getting better. Let's celebrate that. Let's reward you for specifically making those goals. And then once kids have become successful with those goals, then we make them about 20% harder again, and 20% harder again, until over time, we've shifted kids down to a level where they look like most typical children. We're not going to shift kids down to a level where they're perfect, but where they're like most kids. So again, this is a more complex intervention. It's more complex than just the simple moment-to-moment behaviors. And why I encourage you, if kids don't have such high levels of misbehavior, this might not be a necessary tool for families, or it might not be a tool that we go to. But for families that even after these positive behavior changes that the parent has made, and they see things are getting better, if there's still pretty high frequency rates of behavior, this is a tool for helping them to start to make some swifter change. But it's also a tool for parents to start to monitor and say, wow, you know, even though things are still impaired, we're moving in the right direction, and I can look back and see how many days is my child making that goal. Do I know now that it's time to change this goal and to make it harder? I can see when I look back 8 weeks that my child used to be interrupting 15 times a day, and now they're only interrupting 8. That's a big change. It's still not perfect, that's still a lot of interruption, but it's change in the direction that I want to see. Yes?
Any chance you're keeping a corresponding chart for the number of times that the child is showing the desired behavior, say, I'm trying to think of something there, not interrupting, but turning it around, what would you see instead? Because you've gone through the basics of parent training with the parent before you've introduced this. They probably now have some sense of what they would see and hear for the more desired behavior instead. That's what I'm trying to
I think what you're asking is, can you have positive goals on there? So not just does this so many or fewer times, but, you know, enters a conversation appropriately, or
you've already worked on strengthening something, I think, before you've gotten to this point.
So am I understanding your question correctly?
Yeah, I'm wondering if it,
Can it go the other way?
yes.
So the question is, can we have positive goals on here and not just, I'm saying this qualitatively, not in terms of behavioral definitions, but goals like enters, plays nicely with their siblings 2 or more times, or within an interval, or shows respect to mom at least 3 times. Absolutely, you can have goals like that. This is the thing I would caution you about. And I know in some ways this kind of feels like, oh, we're setting up, does all these negative behaviors so many or fewer times. But it's predicated on the notion that kids are doing these behaviors at high frequency rates. And certainly if you're trying to teach a child to do something like to contribute to the family dinner, to add something to the conversation, or to finish their homework, goals can be phrased in a positive way. But sometimes the danger in what we run into with that is, plays nicely with siblings 2 or more times during the day. If there wasn't opportunity for play, that would look like a no rather than looking like a yes.
Right, it's just the report card is for the parent as well as the child, right?
It is.
So the parents really
Right.
focused on all of those negative behaviors they're trying to eliminate or reduce, as opposed to.
So the positive behaviors. Yep.
I didn't know things could get really.
Could get, and certainly in implementation, if parents are using this as like, oh, look, here's another goal you didn't meet again, it can take on a negative tone. But I think that can be the case for a lot of what we do. If parents have the negative supposition, it can come out. But certainly if you are wanting to cue parents to look for some of the positives that their child is doing, by writing that as a goal, it serves as a communication and a prompt with parents to do those things that we want, to notice when those things are happening.
And I can see how this would be important and necessary, especially across the volume of showing, these various target areas. It's just that if it switches the parent over to now,
To a negative mindset.
yeah, negative behavior, prevention.
Yep.
Like that kind of versus the
Yep.
alternative behavior. Oh, missed it.
Yep.
So busy.
And again, I think that's where it's so important to have good clinical judgment and not just setting things up exactly as they're prescribed. Because if you have a family for whom you're specifically worried that this might create a negative tone, I think it's perfectly appropriate to have for every negatively written, however many fewer times you interrupt, have an alternative or complementary goal of, I'm looking for every time my child shares, or I'm looking to notice when they wait before they interrupt me. So not only did they interrupt so many or fewer times, but hey, I just caught you, stopped yourself, you waited before interrupting me. I think that was so great of you. You really showed me a lot of effort there. So things that might cue parents giving attention to positive behavior.
Especially if the parent has not experienced charting before setting up a report card. I'd be really concerned about, this is the first charting that they're doing?
Yeah.
I'd be worried about what they're missing.
And I think that's fair.
It's just a reaction.
No, it's a perfectly fair reaction to have, and again, why I'm glad that you're sharing it, because I think it benefits the group to hear what might be experiences that they could expect and things to be ready for with parents. And again, this specific one was developed for a slightly older child. I don't think that this would be the most appropriate setup for a young child, so for a 3 or 4-year-old. That I would want a behavioral chart to look much differently. And the reason why I'm trying to go through the mechanics and the components of setting up a daily report card or a behavioral chart is that many parents have tried them before and not had success with them. And part of the reason of the lack of success is expecting too great of a change in kids, or buying what can be kind of a generic, commercially available behavioral chart, which is just, did you get dressed, or did you finish your homework, and not looking to set up where the child's at and see improvement. So I respect what you're saying about wanting to make sure that we don't use this as a negative tool, but really what the larger intent is making change over time with kids. So I'm trying to see how the crowd's reacting. Is this something that's making sense to families or to participants, what the intent of a behavioral chart like this is? Okay. So let me move on ahead to the reward forms. So once we set up what the behavioral goals are, which would essentially represent about a 20% change. We also want to set up possible rewards that the child can earn. And this would take the form of the parent and the child working together to come up with a reward menu or a reward chart. So certainly parents can come up with ideas about what their child may want to work for. But I think it's especially important to have the parent and the child do that together, because the parent may find out things that the child's willing to work towards or to work for and get ideas, but they also might help to balance some ideas that kids have. So if you ask kids, what are things that you want to work for? Sometimes kids give us answers like Xbox 360. And no, that might not be something that we can work for in the short term, but it might give parents a sense of a long-term reward to work for. And hopefully what we've put up here are rewards too that are not necessarily monetary or tangible. They can be intangible rewards. And one thing to let parents know about is that oftentimes things that kids naturally like doing, or they're naturally involving themselves with, or they naturally get during the course of the day, by making those contingent, we can see changes in behavior. So if kids typically get dessert at the end of the dinner, if we make that contingent now on showing us certain behaviors, if that's something that they've previously liked, they can move forward to it. Or asking kids what's something that they want to work toward. Yes?
I had a parent once show concern over using food as a reward. And they very educatedly explained to me, you know, that in their family, obesity runs in the family, and that they didn't want to or feel comfortable with using food as any type of reinforcement, because they didn't want that to later turn into a potential eating disorder. Is that something that happens often?
So the question is, what do you think about food rewards? From strictly a behavioral perspective, food motivates people when they're hungry. So when people are satiated, it's not as rewarding, but food is typically a reinforcer or a reward for people. Now, I think it's smart, and I think there are a lot of considerations that we need to keep in place. So if a family is vegetarian and that's something that is a value system of that family, is we don't want to say, oh, put going to McDonald's on your reward menu. Or if a family struggles with obesity and they don't want to tie food rewards to behavior, that's certainly something to respect. Yeah.
That when you do something good and you feel good, then you get to eat something good. So then every time they feel good about something, then they'll, continue rewarding themselves with that food. Obviously, once they get older, because that's something that they're learning as a child.
And certainly for some families and for some kids, that's a very legitimate concern to have. But I don't want to make the statement that all kids or all families are going to develop that same pattern. So in and of itself, is it typically a motivator? Yes. If a parent's uncomfortable with it, just as I would say if a parent says, I don't ever want my kids to play video games, I'm not going to say, well, you have to have that as a reward. So I would respect families' kind of value system and reward system, but also want to include the child for ideas so we know what the child's willing to work towards. Because if a child's willing to work towards snack time of an apple, heck yeah, let's use snack time of an apple. But if they're not going to work towards it, then we need to know that too, so we don't say, I don't understand why they're not working towards apple slices if they just aren't going to work towards apple slices. So does that answer your question? Okay. We also want to set up daily and weekly rewards for behavioral charts. And the daily rewards should be less intensive or less potent than the weekly rewards. So what we want to work with families are, what are smaller incremental things that you would have given to your kids anyway, your kids would have had access to anyway, that now is contingent upon their making behavioral goals. So those would be the types of things to offer for daily rewards. Weekly rewards would be things that they wouldn't necessarily get on a daily basis, but might be things they're allowed to do, like biking over to a friend's house, or having a play date, or calling someone on the phone, or getting to choose what we rent from Blockbuster, or choosing what Family Friday night is, or things that don't happen with such frequency, but having that contingent again. Okay? So am I moving backwards? I'm just flashing through all kinds of things here. So let me go back to the sample daily report card again. So again, for some kids, where we want to move is to a place where kids can earn daily rewards and then weekly rewards based upon meeting their behavioral goals. So with an older child, as the example is here, if an older child can maintain making mostly yeses for a daily reward, we'd want to stay with the least intensive version that we can. If, however, we see that kids start out pretty well in the morning and are making a lot of yeses in the morning, but by after school they're seeming to go downhill, then we may want to chunk up the day more frequently and say you can earn a smaller reward or minutes towards something later for your morning goals. And then if you make your afternoon goals, and then if you make your evening goals, and then your bedtime goals. So with a daily report card or behavioral chart, there should be the flexibility as well to make rewards and the opportunity to earn rewards happen as frequently as needed to keep the child motivated. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, I'm just looking at time, and in the interest of time, I'm going to now segue into how a daily report card is similar to a point system. A point system is similar to a daily report card in that it does necessitate the need for clearly defined behaviors, but rather than clearly defined goals. So with a daily report card, what we've essentially set up are intervals. During this period of time, did you meet this goal as it's defined? A point system is similar, but it's predicated upon frequency. So I'm going to be looking for a specific behavior, or I'm going to be looking for a specific statement or a specific type of thing that the child's eliciting. And when that occurs, the child earns a point for it, or they earn a token for it. So in this situation, if we wanted kids, and I think this is what you were starting to ask about. So with an interval system, you have a period of time where kids either make their goals or not. For some kids that seem to be more motivated by attaining a desired behavior, or you're worried that parents might wait for kids to mess up rather than looking for the good behavior, a point system sets up a goal. Like, what are the positive behaviors that you want to see your child start eliciting? Like waiting before interrupting me. And with a point system, you would go through and say, I'm having a conversation. When the child naturally comes up, if they pause before interrupting you, if that's the behavior that you've determined with the child ahead of time, that's where they would earn a point or a token or some kind of signifier, like, you did the behavior, so now you earn this. Or you see them playing nicely with their sibling. Awesome job, bud, you just earned a token, or you just earned a point, or you earned a point on your point chart because I saw you doing that behavior. It's essentially catching our kids being good and attending and reinforcing that behavior, but specifically with a token or a point or a signifier that this is more than just something verbal that I'm telling you. There's something tangible for you to know you did that elicited behavior. Does that make sense? Okay. So the reward systems, or the reward opportunities with a daily report card, we set up opportunities for the children to earn something tangible or to earn access to something by making a certain portion of their behavioral goals. And you can work with parents to say, okay, if the child makes less than 50%, do they earn any reward? If they make 50 to 60%, do they earn any reward? If they make 80%, what's the reward? And they can have a graduated reward menu. So the more yeses they get, the more enticing or enhancing the reward is. And that's very similar to the point system. With the point system or a token economy, when the child does the positive behavior that we've defined for them, they earn a token, or they earn a point, or they earn some kind of signifier that they did the behavior. And then there are periods of time where they can cash in those points, or those tokens, or those signifiers for a reward. And people have been to Chuck E. Cheese before, or Dave & Buster's, where you see that certain rewards are worth more than other rewards. It's the same type of concept. So you have essentially a reward menu or a reward store, whether it's dessert or extra time or whatnot, that the parent puts a point value onto. So there's either a prescribed period of time where kids can say, I'm going to cash in my points, or I'm going to cash in my tokens, and either save up for this bigger reward or cash it in for the smaller reward. But there's a gradient of possible rewards they can earn for having done that behavior, just as there's gradients for rewards that they can earn for a daily report card. With daily report card, we're working in intervals or time periods. So you've done this so many or fewer times, or you've achieved this so many or more times within this interval. Whereas a token economy, a point system, happens on a frequency basis. Every time I catch you doing the behavior I want to see you do, you earn that point, you earn that token, you earn that signifier somehow. And yet there's still a period of time for you to cash in those points, tokens, or signifiers, just like there's a period of time for you to cash in your intervals of success, or making those goals in predetermined intervals. The difference between the two make sense? Okay. The ninth session then is on response cost. And response cost can be integrated with a point system or token economy, or it can stand on its own. So in a token economy that's positively based, every time we catch the child being good, they earn that point, that token, that signifier. Response cost is we've set up a list of rules or a list of problem behaviors or negative behaviors that want the child to decrease in frequency. So when a child does something positive, they earn that point or that token or that signifier. When they break a house rule or they do another behavior that's been predetermined, they lose a point, they lose a token, they lose a signifier. So their economy, or what they earn for their points, isn't no longer just based on catching your child being good, but it's a balance of, when I see you do the behavior that I want you to do, I notice it, I reward it, I reinforce it. When I see you doing a behavior I don't want you to do, there's a cost to it. There's a punishment to it. Something's being taken away from you. So response cost and token economies are based upon frequency of behaviors, typically. The other way to do a response cost is to set kids up with a set amount of points or a set amount of tokens, and saying, this is how you would lose those tokens, this is how you would lose those points, by breaking a house rule or being aggressive. So again, having a predetermined set of behaviors for which they would lose points, and say, you start with 10, or you start with 20, or you start with 100, whatever it is. But every instance or every frequency of the behavior, you would lose 1 point. And if you have any of those left at the end of our interval, then you can earn your reward. Does that make sense? Okay. So the reason why I'm going through these more generally is because a couple reasons. One, I want to make sure that we introduce all of these concepts before we're out of time today. And also because the three of them are interrelated. So a daily report card is essentially behavioral goal setting based upon an interval schedule and expecting about 20% change at a time. A token economy or a point system is when you are earning and losing points based upon the frequency of occurrence. And the only interval or time period is when those points get cashed in or when those tokens get cashed in. Response cost is when you lose a token or you lose a point for doing a behavior that we want to see decrease over time. And it can be tied into a point system, or it can be a standalone where you start with a number of points and you lose for every instance of the behavior, but as long as there's any of those points or tokens left before reward period, you can still cash them in. So it's essentially either operating on a frequency or an interval schedule to more strategically target or more intensively targets behaviors that we want to see increase and behaviors that we want to see decrease. So again, the mechanics of how to set up these sessions are in the manual that I gave to you, but in terms of overarching concepts, those are the concepts that are underlying these more intensive strategies. So let's pause for a second because I want to hear your reactions to, or what you anticipate might be difficult for parents in implementing daily report cards, point systems, token economies.
I think certainly looking at the younger kids, the daily report card, it might be easier for them, for the parents. What I'm seeing, some of these parents, especially the kids, 3, 4, they're just babies, it just happened. They might tell the truth. I mean, did the child do this in the morning? They might, they might.
So there might be some fudging of the data.
Yeah, which would sort of, it wouldn't work. The same thing as let's say the older kids with the point system. Even for me, I'd say if you give them 10 tokens, 10 tokens, and to take away a token, I can see where it's pulling, and it's easier to give something, and even for the teens or the adolescents that might want something instead of you taking it away. So, but either or, I think they're very. I use the not now, but I used it before, the report card, and it's very effective. Even in the schools where you give it to the teacher and you get them on board. And
Okay.
They do this and they complete that, and they end up then by Friday I'm picking it up and meeting the parents, and it does work.
So it's sounding like what I'm hearing is a barrier to implementation, or something that we need to be aware of ahead of time, is parent consistency and parent truthfulness in the report. So not trying to fudge it to help a child get a reward, or fudge it to keep them from getting a reward, but letting the information kind of stand it as is and use that as a learning tool for the kids, because it's okay if kids don't get their rewards if they didn't earn it. It's sending them a message, just like when you earn your reward, it sends a message. So kind of doing it consistently and truthfully is one thing that you see as a barrier to implementation. What else do people see as barriers to implementation?
It wasn't actually a barrier, but just what you're saying in terms of the taking away points as being sort of negative, but sometimes like bedtime pass program, I never thought of it as being, it is a response cost. I don't know if you're...
No, what was it, bedtime paths?
Pass, basically where the child who's getting out, first would generally start kids that are already about 3, of, you're supposed to stay in your room at bedtime, so the kid who keeps wanting to escape and leave the room. You get 3 passes at the beginning of the night to get up, to go get the water, to go do whatever you want, and as long as you still have a pass at the end of the morning, then you get the reward.
Okay.
So it basically functions as a
Response cost.
where it's something that you would have, you need it to kind of be taking away side of it.
And I think what I'm hearing you say is that is essentially response cost, but you had made a comment about could it be negative. And I think with any of the programs that we set up, or any of the ignoring, we have to coach our parents in how to keep this a productive, positive experience, and not use it as a mechanism for venting frustration or venting the lack of change that kids might be making, but to use it as a tool to make it more salient or tangible to the child. What are other reactions or barriers to implementation that people can foresee? Time.
Right, being able to effectively implement and monitor. And a lot of times, and I'm thinking just in general, the kids, I don't even think about it in my situation where a lot of times I'm not, the kids are here, I'm there. When I get in, we're going to bed. This is the whole time, right? Even with the kids that I work with, just the interaction time between the parents and the child are
limited. And I think that's a realistic barrier. Our parents work, our parents have multiple jobs sometimes, or there's multiple caregivers. And so looking at what time accessibility do we have to ensure that whatever program we set up can be implemented is a realistic one. And what I would emphasize is, I think parents can become discouraged with more complex systems because of things like that. And so we want to make sure we're matching. Even if we think that maybe a point system might be more effective, if it's going to be easier for the parent to implement a response cost, that might be what we start with to maintain the motivation of the program, rather than setting up something that's going to fall apart right away. Okay, oh yes, please.
I was going to say many parents will speak to, I don't want my child hooked on handfuls or hooked on rewards all the time. So I suppose at some point we'll be talking about grading as well with broken economies especially.
Well, we were mentioning earlier, sorry.
I was going to say the same thing, that I hear that a lot from parents too, through staff, that sometimes they feel it's very artificial using the token system over time, that it doesn't feel that it's the real world, but also the impact on the other siblings whose behaviors may not be as problematic. Does that create feelings that one child is favored over the other? Is there resentment that gets built up unintentionally? Those family dynamics, those dynamics that can be created.
And what was said earlier was that there can be a reticence or a reluctance from some parents to implement a strict reward system because they don't want their kids to become, or there's a fear that they're going to become dependent on rewards, or I'm not going to do this unless I get a reward, or that it becomes something expected. So how do we move into a fading? You'd what?
I'd like to answer that.
Sure, please.
I get that too.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, in the real world, we all work for rewards.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, we did not get paid for our jobs.
Yeah.
Or get some type of reward, whatever that may be. Some type of sort of satisfaction, some sort of, you know, you did a great job today. You know, even if you are getting paid, sometimes if you don't get any recognition, you don't want to do that job anymore. So really it is it's real world. We all work for rewards. We do. We have intrinsic altruistic values that we work for, but they don't go far when you're not getting some kind of basically feedback or a reason to do it. So for me, I feel like it is real. It's what you're saying is a token economy. I mean, it's real because in the real world, we're working for certain rewards. We're working to buy a house. We're working to get a car.
Yep.
You know, we're doing things in the real world. So I think you can apply that and say, yeah, it is real, because nobody just wakes up in the morning and says, you know, they're going to do things just because, you know, and it's setting them. You're giving them the behavior. You're modeling the behaviors that they need, but they're definitely going to go. I mean, I think we all do that. I think, in my opinion, we all work for something, right? Some kind of, whatever the reward is, there is a reward, always.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
I really like that reframe because it is a reality check then for parents in terms of introducing what you're just saying, in terms of what we're preparing children for. Because I think there is a little bit of that Disney World magical thinking that it's a child, why are we putting all these expectations, it's feeling very artificial. But I like that reality check in terms of we do it in our adult world, and this is really a preparatory phase for that child.
And I don't know if I did a just job of rephrasing what you were saying, because I think you're saying that might be the reaction from some parents, but how do we prep parents to move from a token economy to more of a maintenance phase? So once we've achieved the behaviors we want to see out of the parents, how do then we remove this more intensive program and go back to more of a generalizable program?
Yeah, how do we get parents to use social rewards and personal contact and various things like that, you know, hold on to the praise.
I'm sorry, I was
caring. It really does talk about fading off tangibles.
Yeah.
That's all. So,
Yeah.
But that's often, I think you were saying, what are some of the things that may come up? And it's very common for parents to raise the issue of, I don't want my kid manipulating me or hooked on tangibles before he's going to do anything.
Yeah.
Like intrinsically, there's something that feels wrong for parents.
Yeah. And I think your reaction is on, for some parents, this feels like it feels contrived. And to an extent, it is contrived. Yeah, it is contrived.
And it starts small, like it is a tangible reward now, but then in 2 weeks it'll be like we were discussing time with mom and dad or whatever. You know, like as they get older and more developed, or it obviously does. It has to change because we all change and they change.
Right.
Yep.
But it's a great opportunity to talk about a sense of purpose.
Yeah.
For the child and the parent, and maybe a sense of purpose in terms of building the relationship. So you can build the fading into, yes, we may need to start with tangibles, but that's.
Yeah. But I'm hearing three different things. I'm sorry. I'm hearing three different things come up, and then I'll come back to it. One is what might be some initial barriers into implementation or initial barriers into engagement, getting parents to do it in the first place. Then if parents are doing it, how do we move from a contrived system with frankly contrived tangible rewards to a less contrived or more generalized implementation? And then thirdly, forgot what my third one. Oh, how do we move from a system at all to more of maintenance? So why don't we back up for a second and first talk about engagement? I think that's what you were commenting on, is that sometimes to get parents engaged, they need to see the value in doing a more complex system, because the reality is for every parent, just as it is for all of us, there's a cost and a benefit. There is a cost to doing more intensive programs like token economies, point systems, and daily report cards. And the cost is the effort, the maintenance of consistency, the time that it takes, and if using tangible rewards, the tangible rewards is a real cost. And if parents aren't seeing the benefit from that, or they're feeling some sense of this doesn't connect with my parenting philosophy, the costs can outweigh the benefits. And we make value judgments of cost and benefit all the time. So we have to help parents explore what are the possible benefits. And really, it comes down to, does the benefit outweigh the cost? And for some families, I want to make sure that we're respecting what you're saying, is that some families strongly feel that moving towards tangible rewards or a system like this has a big cost to it. And at the end of the day, the benefit compared to the cost may be outweighed. The cost might be greater. And then this might not be the system for them that we set up. We may want to work more intensively with our social reward, social reinforcement, our attending, because even though the change might be slower, there's still change there. And that might be something that aligns more closely with the parent's value system, and the benefit outweighs. So we might help the parents to articulate what are the possible benefits from a system like this. And what some of the benefits might be is a documentation or a communication tool for monitoring progress in kids making swifter change, and kids buying into the program more. So if it's a token economy, if we see buy-in and we see kids working towards a reward, we may have to change that reward later, but it might be motivation for them. And the other thing I think we need to look at, because cost is legitimately a time in setting up a program like this, is having parents articulate or value what time are they putting into managing this behavior now that might be lessened by a token economy or a point system or a daily report card. So those are some strategies for engagement. And I'm sorry, I've been making you wait with your comment for a long time.
But with the parent who might have some objection, if that's the right word, it's like a reality check for them. I remember once asking a parent when they sort of resisting on that and they, getting hooked in the rewards, and I said, how much college fund you have set up for the child? They look at me and said, well, you going to pay for their college, or you want them to try and earn scholarships and things like that? Because scholarships, this is a discipline. This is something that helps this child to build up certain behavior for success, whatever they want to turn. We got the message real clear.
So you were looking at a long-term cost-benefit analysis for the parent.
And that's really what it is for the child. And I don't think it's too early for you to start these children this type of positive, instead of goofing off all the time in the world, to have a set stripe, a homework for this, for that, for the other, and the reward for the parent, for the child in the long run. And I think they're getting, especially when you talk money.
Yeah, so you make the analogy to that. Let's shift back over to the other point that you raised, because I think it's an important one, which is moving from an intensive system to more generalization, and how you make that shift over time. Because again, part of the reason why I wanted to pause after we got through timeout is because all of these behavioral changes were ones that didn't involve a more complex management system. And I did want us to check in with parents and see, are we making progress? Is there a need or a decision to go to a more complex system? Because it is harder to maintain, it is harder to implement, and it is harder to be consistent. So I want us to have a good reality check about, is this necessary, or can we keep it simple with these behavior changes that we've made with parents? But let's say we've gotten to that point where something more intensive does seem warranted, and we've talked about the costs and the benefits with parents about, in terms of the costs of your time, your effort, etc. Will it be outweighed by the possible benefits of a response cost system, or a point system, or an interval system like a daily report card? And they agree that yes, the benefit would be there. And so we start to implement it and we see change over time. What's our decision-making point for when we move from having a more protracted, contrived system like this, which it is, to moving towards a generalization system? So what would be, as a therapist, some decision-making strategies, or what would be decision points for you to know that we were starting to fade out a system like this and reintegrate a more naturalistic way? I don't know if I phrased that the best way. Did that make sense, what I asked? Okay. So what are some decision-making points about when we shift away from a reward-based or a point-based or a token-based system back to just behavioral principles that we're using as parents. Is the child making progress? Okay. And so what level of progress would we expect for us to start to fade out a more intensive system? Okay, so looking at, is the child achieving the success that we want them to at about 8 times out of 10, if we had to say how frequently are they making their goals? Okay, so is the child improving? I'm sorry.
How often the school is calling in you in for meetings on this, if it has reduced from, 2 or 3 times a week to maybe once a week, then you know it's working. So that, certainly in the inner city schools here, that's big time. How many times the teachers call you?
So how many times the teacher is calling you, or if it's a home-based strategy, how many times are we still experiencing a more intensive punishment system like timeout, or having to resort to a more intensive technique to manage misbehavior? Let's say the child is making progress, and so they are meeting their goals realistically 8 times out of 10, and we've shifted their goals down to a more, so they're looking like our other kids, are looking like typically developing kids in terms of the frequency of what we're doing. How do we then shift from a more intensive system to a less intensive system? What might be some strategies? And I think you were speaking about one earlier.
Oh, for me, I look at, children develop and they get older and things change. Even the token economy might change over time because, this rule is obviously mastered. You're given the token like every 10 minutes or something. I don't know, like it becomes like, okay, we got this one. And then now that something else might have developed there, that you have to change the rule. So I just feel like you go with the development, like, and then eventually, hopefully, whatever, and it's subjective to your household. Basically, if I can live with 3 interruptions a day,
then it's not
something. Then, as far as I'm concerned, the goal is achieved.
So we're looking at, have goals been achieved? And you're also looking at what it sounds like is maybe shifting from using tangible tokens to maybe more verbal reminders, and then slowly shifting from tangible rewards to intangible rewards, or to verbal rewards or physical rewards again. So it sounds like what you're suggesting is taking the shift slowly from just stopping to do the system altogether to first changing maybe the frequency of the system, how tangible is the system, changing the rewards from tangibles to intangibles, and seeing, does the behavior level maintain? If the behavior level starts to change, we may need to go back to where we were before and maintain a bit longer, and then start piece by piece taking away some of the behavior system that we had set up and seeing, does the behavior, the desired behavior that I want, does it maintain? And
I said all that, that's amazing.
I probably put some words in your mouth, I'm sorry.
Wonderful, how you did that.
I might have had it planted in my head. I might have snuck some in there. But but I think what we want to coach our parents with is, because I do agree that for some parents, these are more intensive and they are harder to maintain. And for parents to think, I am going to have to do this forever, feels like the cost is going to outweigh the benefits. So managing our parents' expectations in terms of how long we anticipate that we'll have to do this, or what's going to be our criteria, or even setting that criteria up front with the parents. If we're moving to a more complex system, what do we hope to achieve with that? What's our long-term goal? And setting that long-term goal, again, for parents, is definable and observable as possible. So not just attitude gets better, but what does that mean for you? When would you know that the cost benefits no longer there for doing this more intensive system? Because I do think we need to acknowledge it is more difficult for parents to do. And if it's going to be a forever long-term thing, then that might not be the choice they want to make. And saying, let's define what that outcome is. And then as we start to reach that outcome, looking at whatever system we have and saying, what are the components making this system effective? Is it the frequency of reward? Is it the type of reward? Is it how we're monitoring the program? Is it the tangible chips, or is it the points, or is it, cashing in your ticket at bedtime? And saying, let's systematically start to remove one of those components. So if we want to keep the tangibles, let's space out the rewards a little more and see, does this behavior, that desired behavior that we reached, maintain? If it does, let's move from tangible rewards to intangible rewards. Does our behavior maintain? Let's start to fade out the physical prompts and go to verbal prompts. Does the behavior maintain? And bringing parents in as partners in that, I think, can help to mitigate or to normalize some of those feelings they have about the cost outweighing the benefit. And I want to emphasize, if we can manage behaviors and we're seeing change and families are doing well with just making behavioral changes from the way they're reacting to kids, sometimes the benefit of a more complex system is outweighed by the cost. We want to do these more complex systems when the behavior is warranted, when the changes we've made so far haven't produced enough change or swift enough change. And so there tends to be a rationale for doing these. I don't advise doing them unless there's a rationale for it. Okay? Let me pause for a second because, again, I realize we're running into the end of our time together. But what are other questions that I can answer for you generally about social learning theory or behavioral parent training programs, behavioral techniques? I hope that I've put enough information into the manual as well that you can go back and look at that as a resource when going to do certain sessions. But I want to make sure that we've addressed any concerns or questions that you have, so you're leaving feeling that you have a sense of what you would do. So what are things that I can address? Yes?
Where we get a little bit of pushback sometimes is more around a purely behavioral approach and the interplay with cultural factors. Because this model is very linear and very prescriptive, and it's interesting, at the same time, that's the beauty about the model. It's very straightforward, very simple, very step-by-step. But the challenge is not all of our clients are kind of linear naturally in their thinking, right?
Right.
You have more your spiral thinkers. I mean, there's a diversity piece, even how we're wired as human beings.
Absolutely.
Our thinking patterns. So culturally, many of our clients are contextual in their thinking, so they need that time to share their narratives with us, to share their stories at their own pace. And sometimes when you want to take them to a more linear way of doing the work, they sometimes get sidetracked.
Sure.
You want to bring them back, and it's a bit of a tug because you want to follow the client's pace. But then you want to also bring them back to do some of the clinical work. So any thoughts
on how to balance
by
that?
our colleagues here in terms of what your experiences are?
Yeah, and I think for me, my initial reaction was I might at some point be an expert in behavior and how learning occurs and how behavior is shaped. But I'm never going to be the expert of someone else's family or somebody else's child or them. And if I take that standpoint that I'm here to tell you what to do or how to change your child's behavior, I think I've lost from the start, because no matter how much I know about learning, I'm never going to be part of the fabric of that family. And so I tried to take the stance too of, I'm here to support you in making changes. And sometimes if it feels unnatural to families or feels like there is resistance, sometimes the answer is, do we want to try it? And I'll be here to help you evaluate if it worked or not, but it's ultimately up to you to try it. And that is true, because when they leave my office or they leave my session and they go home, if they don't want to try it, they're not going to. And so supporting them, and is this something you want to try, or is this something we need to come back to? Or do I need to go to a different skill for a while that they might feel more positively about, or get naturally more reinforced, or feel that it aligns more with them, and then reintroduce something later and say, we talked about this before, and it was something that you weren't seeing a lot of success with, or something that didn't seem appealing to you. I'm bringing it back up again because X, Y, and Z. Because this is how I see it fitting in. But I want to know, is this something that you're open to trying, to at least seeing what the effect is, or something that you're open to trying with me, or we can try together. So it's a balance between, I think what you're saying is coaching and encouraging the parents in their progress, but also coming in at a point where you're a partner with them rather than telling them what to do.
And I like the pacing and the flexibility piece, that you can adapt this to your client's situation, especially because the clinical work also happens in different languages too by clinicians. So they have to, do the work in different languages. And when we don't have the language availability in the agency, we have to contract out a bona fide language interpreter. So you can see it can get a little convoluted.
Absolutely.
Language barrier in terms of trying to stay as pure as possible to the behavioral approach, but with flexibility, keeping in mind the language piece.
And I think the ultimate things we come down to is we have talked about a number of antecedent-based strategies and a number of reinforcement-based strategies and a number of punishment-based strategies. But they are strategies. They are not in and of themselves punishment or in and of themselves reinforcement or in and of themselves antecedents. They are typically useful antecedents or typically useful punishment strategies or typically useful reinforcement strategies. I think our overarching directive has to be, as we're working with our clients, is what we're doing increasing the behaviors that we want to increase or that our parents want to increase. Are they decreasing the behaviors that our parents want to decrease? And if they're not, then we have to come back to the drawing board as a clinician and with our parents to try a different strategy and try it out systematically. Because again, that's the beauty of what reinforcement and punishment are. They are things that increase or decrease behaviors. And so we can always come back to that as kind of the bedrock of what we're trying to shift and evaluate, are the behaviors changing the way that we intend them to? And we might have to come back to a new strategy if they're not, or to evaluate the context in which the strategy is being implemented to evaluate, is it changing behaviors the way we intend to? Any other questions? No? Okay, I think we're gonna wrap up for the day. Thank you guys. I hope that this was, oh, thank you. Thank you, that's really nice.